Hey there, Drowsy Historian here. Tonight we're travelling back nearly 4,000 years to an island at the centre of the ancient world, a place of colour, ritual and calm sophistication that Europe almost forgot. Long before Greece, before Rome, before anyone called it Europe at all, there was Crete. This is the story of the Minoans, the first civilization on European soil, and one of its most mysterious. Before we start this journey, do me one small favour. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. If you'd prefer these stories without ads, you can join the Patreon. It's linked in the description. And if you want the ultimate immersive experience, consider using a pair of wireless earbuds. They're comfortable, discreet, and designed so you can wear them even while sleeping. I've linked my favourite pair, plus other sleep tools, in the description. Now, lie back, get comfortable. Let's begin. Long before the words Europe or civilization meant anything at all, there was an island where the Aegean meets the wider Mediterranean. Long, mountainous, and caught between continents. Crete. It rises out of the sea like the back of a sleeping creature, ridged with stone and olive trees, surrounded by waters that shimmer, deceptively calm. To the north lies Greece, to the south Egypt, and far to the east lies the Levant, each near enough to trade with, but far enough to remain mysterious. Crete is both a bridge and a boundary, a place where people learned early that survival depended on reading the moods of the sea. The mountains seemed to pour straight into the surf, their slopes patched with scrub and goats, their valleys green where rivers, brief and seasonal, remember to flow. The first settlers arrived by boat, which tells you something about them already. They came from elsewhere, Anatolia perhaps, or the Cyclades, bringing obsidian blades, seeds and stubbornness. They built small villages along the coast, houses of mud, brick and timber, clustered like barnacles against the cliffs. In these early days, the island offered everything and demanded everything in return. The soil was thin but fertile, the weather generous but fickle. Earthquakes shook the ground without warning. Still they stayed. They learned to coax olives and grapes from the hillsides, to raise goats and sheep, to gather fish from the silver-blue expanse that surrounded them. The surrounding seas were their field and their road, their defence and their danger. As the centuries passed, the scattered settlements of Crete began to knit themselves together. Among these growing communities, one began to rise above the rest. A city perched near the island's northern coast, overlooking fertile plains and a natural harbour. It would endure long after its people vanished, Knossos. At first it was no more than a cluster of homes and workshops, a market town bound by trade. But generation by generation, the town expanded, its streets widening, its courtyards multiplying, its walls layered upon older foundations until the entire settlement seemed to swell with its own importance. By the middle of the second millennium BCE, Knossos had become the heart of the island, not a city of kings, but of coordinators, priests and artisans. To later eyes it would appear royal. In truth, it was administrative, sacred and communal all at once. To call it a palace is convenient, but misleading. It was something stranger and more sophisticated, a living labyrinth of storage, ceremony, and quiet authority. At its height, Knossos was unlike anything else in Europe. 4 stories of courtyards and corridors wound together in deliberate confusion, each chamber branching into the next. There were staircases that descended towards cellars full of jars, and others that spiralled upward into light wells, where air and sun spilled down into the rooms below. Floors gleamed with polished gypsum, and walls glowed with painted life. Lilies, dolphins, acrobats, and bulls. Columns, painted red and black, flared at the top like inverted trees. Even the ceilings were alive with colour, and the entire structure seemed designed to make motion visible. People crossing from room to room, voices rising from one level to another, doors opening onto unexpected courtyards. No single ruler's throne dictated its shape. The architecture seems to have evolved organically, each generation adding new chambers and corridors, like roots spreading beneath an olive tree. The result was a place that felt less designed than grown, as though the building itself had a will. There were no outer walls or defensive gates. The complex opened itself to the air and to the people who worked within it: priests, scribes, artisans, merchants, and attendants. If there was a king, he must have been a quiet one, for Knossos was not built for ceremony so much as for continuity, the daily movement of goods, records, and rituals that kept the island alive. To walk its halls, even in imagination, is to sense how the Minoans saw their world. They valued balance, light, and rhythm. The very stones seem arranged to imitate the harmony they sought in life. Narrow staircases gave way to open courts. Dark corridors suddenly spilled into spaces flooded with sun. The palace breathed like a lung, taking in shadow, exhaling brilliance. Water channels ran beneath the floors, carrying waste and rainwater away through hidden pipes. It was, technically speaking, Europe's first plumbing system. Storage was the heartbeat of Knossos. Beneath its courtyards ran endless rows of storerooms, packed with pythoi, great clay jars that held oil, wine, and grain. Each jar was marked with a seal, a sign of the bureaucracy that kept the island running. It wasn't power measured by armies or conquest, but by inventory. Scribes with reed pens recorded shipments in a language that even now resists translation, while labourers hauled goods up and down ramps that connected the many levels. The air inside must have smelled of oil and dust, faintly sweetened by the aroma of beeswax and the smoke of olive lamps. The sound of footsteps echoed off plaster walls, joined by the faint hum of scribes murmuring numbers to themselves. Elsewhere in the complex, artisans mixed pigments and polished stone seals carved with spirals, and creatures both real and imagined. Priests performed ceremonies in small shrines decorated with images of snakes and sacred horns. In one chamber, a single gypsum seat sat raised above the floor, later romanticized as a throne, though it might just as easily have been a ritual chair or a symbol of authority no one actually occupied. To label it royal is to miss the point. Power in Knossos was diffused, ritualized, bureaucratic, and beautiful. It existed not in crowns or weapons, but in schedules and ceremonies, in the precise timing of festivals and the careful counting of jars. The palace's grandeur was not meant to intimidate, it was meant to harmonize. The Minoans, unlike their contemporaries in Egypt or Mesopotamia, seemed unbothered by monumentality. There are no colossal statues of rulers, no carved conquests in stone. Their pride lay instead in proportion, in corridors that caught the morning light just so, in walls painted with motion and balance. Even their frescoes suggest a preference for fluidity over hierarchy. Women and men depicted together in ritual, nature treated as something sacred rather than conquered. If this was power, it was power expressed through grace. In every direction, Knossos carried evidence of a society that saw beauty not as ornament, but as function. Its light wells were as practical as they were poetic. Its frescoes served as calendars of ritual and commerce. To stand in one of its courtyards would have been to feel enclosed yet unconfined, a paradox that seems to define the Minoans themselves. The building was a labyrinth, not because it confused, but because it connected. Each passage led to another, each threshold offered choice. From the terraces of Knossos, the sea was always visible. It glittered beyond the olive groves, patient and persuasive, as though reminding the island of who truly rules it. For the Minoans, the horizon was not a boundary, but an invitation. Their world did not end at the coastline. It began there. Crete eventually became the centre of an Aegean network that stretched from the shores of Egypt to for the mountains of Anatolia, from the harbours of Cyprus to the islands of the Cyclades. Its ships traced invisible routes across the Mediterranean, carrying not soldiers, but goods, ideas, and influence. These were not fragile fishing boats. The Minoans built vessels long and low, their wooden hulls stitched together with rope and caulked with pitch, designed to glide rather than batter through the waves. The prows rose like bird beaks, curved and elegant, while the sides bore painted symbols, spirals, dolphins, and sacred horns that made even trade ships look ceremonial. Each carried amphorae of oil, honey, and wine, alongside copper from Cyprus, tin from Anatolia, and obsidian blades sharp enough to slice glass. It was through this exchange that Crete found its strength. Bronze for tools and weapons, saffron for dye and ritual, pottery for prestige. They ruled not with armies, but with invoices. Along the coasts of the ancient world, Minoan ships became a familiar sight. Egyptian tomb paintings depict foreigners bearing gifts of Cretan pottery and textiles, their captains wearing bracelets of carved shell and linen tunics dyed red with madder. In return came gold, papyrus, and alabaster, goods that found their way back to the storerooms beneath Knossos, carefully recorded by scribes who may never have seen the countries they tallied. The island's harbours thrived on this steady rhythm of arrival and departure. It was not empire in the sense of conquest, but empire in the sense of indispensability. To control trade was to control peace. What is most remarkable is what the Minoans did not build. Nowhere on Crete are there fortifications of the kind that defined Mesopotamia or Egypt. No walls thick enough for chariots, no towers, no defensive ditches. The island seems to have lived unguarded, trusting in distance and diplomacy rather than spears. Archaeologists have puzzled over this for decades. Was it idealism, confidence, or simply geography? Whatever the answer, the Minoans appear to have been content to let the sea serve as their fortress. The same waves that carried wealth also discouraged invasion. Their navy was their insurance and their reputation their deterrent. Few dared to cross a people who could cut off half the Mediterranean's trade by merely staying in port. Peace, when achieved by commerce, produces a different kind of grandeur. Instead of monuments to victory, the Minoans left warehouses of abundance. Instead of records of battle, they left ledgers of exchange. Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea were less like royal capitals than shipping hubs with temples attached. The economy became its own religion, goods moving with the same precision as rituals, storage jars replacing altars as symbols of prosperity. Where other civilizations carved their gods into mountain stone, the Minoans painted theirs in movement and colour, as though to suggest that harmony, not conquest, was divine. The sea gave them more than wealth, it gave them rhythm. Festivals followed the sailing season, rituals coincided with harvests and trade winds. The island's calendar was written not in stars or sand, but in tides. Each year, ships left with full holds and returned with stories of foreign gods, strange spices, and new pigments. Every arrival brought change, but a subtle one, absorbed and reinterpreted, as though Crete filtered the world through its own gentler light. Egyptian blue, Levantine purple, Cypriot copper, all became Minoan once they touched the island's soil. Yet even a peaceful sea hides its dangers. To rely on trade is to rely on others, and to rely on others is to invite imbalance. The prosperity that poured into Crete also reshaped it. Wealth pooled in the hands of administrators, scribes, and priests who managed the flow of goods. The great storerooms of Knossos filled faster than they emptied, and a system that once bound communities together began to stratify them. The island that had built its identity on openness slowly became dependent on the very networks it commanded. When the winds failed or politics shifted in distant lands, Crete trembled. The Minoans had mastered motion, but motion cannot be mastered for long. Still at their height, theirs was a civilization that seemed to float. The Minoans built ships as confidently as they built courtyards, guided by the same logic of balance and proportion. They knew that control did not mean confinement. The sea, after all, cannot be fenced. It can only be understood. That understanding was their true achievement. While other Bronze Age societies fortified themselves against the unknown, the Minoans embraced it, sending their olive oil and pottery into waters where no map yet reached. Theirs was a trust born of experience that the sea, if treated with respect, would always bring them home. Archaeologists sometimes call this the thalassocracy, the rule of the sea. It's a poetic term, and a fair one. For 2 centuries or more, Crete's influence radiated quietly across the Mediterranean, not through conquest, but through consistency. A Minoan jar might sit in an Egyptian palace or a Levantine port, recognizable by its spiral patterns and creamy clay, testifying to a civilization that preferred presence over power. Where others sought domination, the Minoans sought circulation. It was a fragile kind of control, but for a time it worked. In this maritime world, the boundaries between commerce and culture blurred completely. Traders became diplomats, sailors became messengers, and the line between ritual offering and export good was sometimes indistinguishable. A jar of oil might be sent to a neighbouring island as payment, gift, or blessing. It didn't matter which. What mattered was that the exchange continued. Even religion seemed to flow with the currents. Foreign symbols appear in Minoan shrines, adapted and domesticated until they fit the island's aesthetic of movement and calm. Crete was not isolated, it was curated. The Minoan ships moved like extensions of their cities, mobile branches of Knossos itself. Each voyage carried more than goods. It carried the island's reputation, its art, its scent of olive oil and beeswax, its reputation for reliability. A Minoan captain arriving in an Egyptian port did not represent an empire, but something more subtle, a civilization that offered order without oppression. And that, perhaps, was its quiet power, to make cooperation seem inevitable. The harbours gleam with bronze and the storerooms of Knossos overflow. The island stands unwalled, confident in its rhythm, certain of its balance. From the hilltop terraces, one might watch the ships drift out to the horizon, the sunlight flashing on their oars. The sea remains both master and servant, gentle, generous, and, for the moment, entirely theirs. Soon, however, the wealth it brings will begin to reshape the people who depend on it. Prosperity has a way of creating its own kind of hierarchy. In the next chambers of this civilization, among the frescoes and storerooms, the question will quietly rise. Who holds the scales that measure such balance? We get an idea of that by studying the frescoes. Inside the great buildings of Crete, every surface breathed with colour. Walls glowed with scenes of dancers, of animals in motion, of ceremonies that turned daily life into rhythm. Among them one figure appeared again and again, the woman. She stood tall, arms lifted toward the sky, her skirts flaring like waves. She held serpents that coiled around her wrists, or she poured offerings onto altars wreathed with flowers. Sometimes she led a procession of attendants, sometimes she stood alone before a sacred tree. Wherever she appeared, the scene seemed to centre itself around her. The women of Crete moved with the same assurance as their world, balanced, bright, deliberate. They wore layered skirts of flounced linen, patterned with rosettes and stripes, and open bodices that revealed rather than concealed. Their hair curled in ringlets down their backs, tied with ribbons dyed from saffron and indigo. Jewellery glinted at their necks and wrists. Beads of gold, faience and carved shell. The Minoans adorned the body not to disguise it, but to celebrate its rhythm, the pulse that matched the sea's own. In these painted scenes, women presided over rituals and festivals with a calm authority. They received offerings, guided dancers, and raised their hands in gestures of invocation. The men in these frescoes were there too, but they moved around the women rather than above them. They leapt bulls, played instruments, or carried gifts. Their roles were kinetic, while the women's were composed. It was not a hierarchy of power, but a choreography of purpose. Motion, answering, stillness. Life on Crete seemed to follow that same balance. Women managed households and workshops, tending to weaving, pottery and trade. They appeared in shrines, on seals, and even on storage jars, suggesting that their influence extended beyond domestic life into ritual and administration. In the sanctuaries atop mountains and in the caves where offerings were left to the gods, women acted as intermediaries, not isolated priestesses, but public figures of ceremony. The island's religion reflected this harmony. Nature and divinity were intertwined. The gods dwelled not in distant heavens, but in the trees, the mountains, and the animals themselves. The female form mirrored this closeness to life. The goddess, or perhaps many goddesses, appeared as mother, hunter, or serpent bearer, each aspect tied to renewal and continuity. When a woman in a shrine lifted a cup of wine to the air, she became part of that same divine cycle, human and sacred blurred into one act of offering. No one there spoke of rule or domination. The Minoans seemed uninterested in hierarchy for its own sake. Their power lay in participation, in shared rituals that bound rather than divided. A ceremony in the courtyard might involve dozens of women dressed in colour, their arms moving in unison as drums and flutes wove through the air. Each gesture was precise but fluid, as if rehearsed over generations. The audience was not commanded but invited. It was a society that organised itself around grace. The Minoans seemed to understand that beauty was not excess, it was balance. Every painted line, every stitched hem followed a rhythm. The women of Crete embodied that rhythm as naturally as they breathed. Their movements were measured, their presence constant. Even in labour there was elegance, the rhythmic spin of the spindle, the careful knotting of cords, the slow pouring of oil into amphorae. Nothing was hurried, because time there was circular, governed by the seasons, the tides, and the festivals that marked their return. Scholars in some future age might have wondered if this meant that women ruled Crete. The question itself would have missed the point. Here, authority was not claimed, it was expressed. To lead a ritual, to preside over a market, to guard the sacred hearth. All were forms of stewardship, not command. Men and women moved through these roles as naturally as dancers exchanging places. The island ran on cooperation, and cooperation required balance, not rank. Even the symbols of their world reflected this duality. The double axe, the labyrinth, appeared in both temples and storerooms, marking spaces that were at once sacred and practical. It was neither a weapon nor a tool, but a sign of balance, two edges equal in weight. The same idea flowed through their art. The women and the bulls, the dancers and the priests, all were bound in a cycle of movement and return. There were no walls between worship and work, between the divine and the human. The festivals of the island showed this harmony at its fullest. In the courtyards of Knossos, processions wound through colonnades, lined with painted lilies. Musicians played reed pipes while acrobats vaulted over bulls in arcs of motion so fluid they seemed choreographed by the sea itself. Women led the procession, holding garlands and baskets of grain. They moved with a kind of solemn joy, neither spectacle nor submission, but something in between. Here, devotion was not fear, It was participation in the balance of the world. For a society without defensive walls, they certainly understood boundaries. Yet the boundaries they painted and performed were not barriers but connections, lines that defined movement, not exclusion. The Minoans appeared to measure order not by containment, but by flow. The women at the centre of these frescoes embodied that principle: calm amid motion, form within freedom. Each face, each gesture, captured a society that seemed to have found strength in gentleness. Where other peoples carved kings from stone, the Minoans painted women in motion, their authority expressed through rhythm, their power through stillness. Their world needed no walls because its harmony lay in balance, and balance left no need for defence. High on the slopes of Crete's mountains, where the wind moved like a restless spirit and the sea glittered far below, the Minoans built their sanctuaries. There were no towering temples or marble facades here, only stone platforms, rough altars, an open sky. Worship did not belong indoors. The people climbed with their offerings: honey, oil, grain, and small bronze figurines. And they gathered where clouds touched the earth. There in the thin air, priests and priestesses began to move. Drums sounded, flutes joined, and the rhythm of worship became something seen as much as heard. Faith was motion. Their religion seemed born from the landscape itself. Crete's mountains and caves, its wind, its endless horizon, all became stages for devotion. The gods lived in the air and in the earth. They were the sea's calm and its storm, the grain's return and its hunger. The people did not separate the divine from the natural world. The mountain peak was a temple, the olive tree an altar, and the bull a living symbol of strength and renewal. The gods demanded no words, only patterns, steps, gestures, and repeated acts that shaped meaning from movement. At the great peak sanctuaries, ceremonies began before dawn. Fires flickered in shallow pits as worshippers faced east, waiting for the first light to spill across the island. When the sun rose, they lifted their arms to greet it. The wind scattered their voices, carrying chants across the ridges. Offerings were placed on stones worn smooth by generations of hands. Cups of milk, small bronze axes, coils of wool. Nothing was wasted, nothing forgotten. The same gestures were performed year after year, their purpose less to ask for favour than to preserve rhythm, the balance between people and the world that sustained them. The same reverence continued in the lowlands, where the palaces became theatres of devotion. Within their broad courtyards, bull leaping took place, a spectacle, equal parts worship, sport and dance. The crowd pressed close as the bull was led forward, its coat brushed with oil until it gleamed in the sun. Flute players struck up a pulsing rhythm, and the acrobats began their run. One seized the horns, vaulted over the animal's back, and landed behind it in a graceful twist. It was not cruelty, but choreography, a test of timing and trust. For the Minoans, to master motion was to approach the divine. Bulls filled every corner of Minoan life. They adorned seals, frescoes, jewellery, and vessels. Archaeology might one day suggest that if it wasn't nailed down, someone painted a bull on it. To outsiders, it might have seemed obsession, but to the Minoans it was a language. The bull represented vitality contained, the raw power of nature transformed into beauty and order. Its horns, replicated in plaster and stone, framed the entrances of temples and courtyards, turning the symbol of wild strength into architecture itself. Another sacred image, carved and carried everywhere, was the labrys. It appeared on walls, in sanctuaries, even on small charms worn by priests. To others, it might have looked like a weapon, but in Crete it meant balance. Two blades of equal weight joined at the centre, each reflecting the other, like the dual forces of creation and destruction, sea and land, life and death. The labyrinth was both symbol and philosophy, its symmetry a reminder that power and harmony must coexist. The Minoans' faith had no central scripture, no rigid priesthood to guard its truths. Belief flowed through their society as easily as trade through their harbours. Rituals were communal, inclusive, and constant. During harvest, processions wound through the fields, leaving offerings in baskets hung from olive branches. At planting, farmers poured wine into the furrows before the first seeds. In times of storm, people sang to the sea, not to command it, but to be heard by it. Their devotion carried no plea for conquest or victory, only a request for balance, between labour and rest, between giving and taking. Caves were the other face of their faith. Where the mountains represented ascent, the caves symbolised descent, a return to the womb of the earth. There the air was cool and damp, smelling of clay and resin. Torches illuminated stalactites that glimmered like frozen rain. Offerings lay in shallow pools, tiny figurines, shells, and cups of oil left afloat on the water's surface. The drip of moisture echoed like a heartbeat. The gods of these depths were not distant. They were elemental, felt rather than seen. To pray here was not to speak, but to listen, to feel the pulse of the island itself. Every act of devotion, whether on mountaintop or in cavern, was tied to movement. Dancers whirled in circles that mirrored the island's own cycles. The tides, the moon, the seasons. The gestures repeated endlessly, changing only with the light. Faith was not an interruption of daily life, but its continuation. A farmer ploughing his field performed as sacred an act as a priest pouring wine. The line between ceremony and survival was almost invisible. To live on Crete was to worship, and to worship was to live in rhythm with the island's pulse. Even art became an extension of faith. Frescoes captured the same gestures seen in ritual: arms raised, bodies arched, animals mid-leap. The walls of homes and temples alike bore the same motifs: spirals, waves, lilies and bulls, each repeating the pattern of renewal. There was no distinction between decoration and devotion. The act of painting, of shaping, of weaving was prayer in motion. The Minoans seemed to believe that beauty itself kept the world turning, that the gods required grace more than fear. The island's faith asked for no monuments of conquest. Instead, it built altars of harmony, temporary, breathable, alive. When the ceremonies ended, the offerings were left to weather and wind, to return naturally to the world. The people did not guard their gods, they trusted them to remain. And so worship could happen anywhere, in the quiet of a workshop, in the fields during harvest, in the song that rose from the docks as ships departed for trade. The divine was not a destination, but a constant companion. When the ceremonies ended and the last song faded into the wind, the people descended from the mountains. The path wound through olive groves, silvered by dawn, the scent of smoke and resin still clinging to their hair. Below them lay the towns, white walls, red roofs, the faint glimmer of sea between the hills. The same hands that had lifted offerings to the gods now carried baskets, tools and jars. The sacred gave way to the ordinary, though on Crete the two were rarely different things. In the soft light of morning, the island stirred to life. Courtyards filled with voices, and streets echoed with the sound of carts rolling over stone. Children chased each other through narrow alleys, their laughter mingling with the rhythmic calls of merchants. From open windows came the scent of bread baking, of oil warming in clay pots, of figs split and left to dry in the sun. Life here was not hurried but steady, guided by patterns as familiar as prayer. Artisans worked at their craft with the same concentration as priests at their altars. In one street, potters sat at their wheels, shaping clay into elegant amphorae. Their hands turned in smooth practiced circles, the vessels rising with the grace of something inevitable. In another, metalworkers hammered bronze sheets into pins and blades, the ringing echo carrying across the town. Painters brushed bright pigments onto fresh plaster, decorating walls with lilies, birds, and spirals. Beauty was not reserved for the temples, it was built into the bones of daily life. Even a storage jar could bear a flourish of blue. In the shade of courtyards, women wove linen on upright looms, the threads trembling like harp strings in the breeze. The rhythm of weaving matched the rhythm of the island, the shuttle passing back and forth like the tides, the patterns forming slowly in saffron and indigo. Their craft clothed the households of Crete and filled the cargo holds of ships bound for distant ports. Each length of cloth carried more than labour. It carried continuity. To weave was to remember. Meals were simple but generous, bread baked from barley, dipped in olive oil and sprinkled with herbs, fresh fish from the coast, figs and cheese from the mountain villages, honey thick as amber, wine scented with resin. Every table was a small echo of the island itself. Sea, soil and sunlight combined in balance. They ate not to excess but with appreciation, using ceramics painted with the same calm artistry as their frescoes. Nothing here was without thought. Even the arrangement of food reflected the Minoans' instinct for harmony. Markets were the island's arteries. In the town squares, traders shouted good-naturedly across rows of goods. Amphorae of oil, baskets of grapes, coiled ropes, folded cloth. The barter was lively, but polite. The same community that danced together in festivals also did business together each morning. A fisherman might trade his catch for pottery. A weaver might exchange linen for honey. There was little need for walls or guards. Trust was the island's currency. The houses themselves reflected this same sense of balance. Built of stone and plaster, with wooden beams and flat roofs, they clustered close for shade and companionship. Each home opened inward to a small courtyard where vines grew, doves nested, and water collected in shallow basins. Rainwater flowed through clay pipes, an early system of drainage that made the houses feel both civilized and alive. Some even had gravity-fed water features and drains, a small miracle of engineering that brought spring water from the hills. Cleanliness and order were quiet virtues. Streets were swept, vessels sealed, floors smoothed with plaster. People bathed often, not from vanity, but from the same belief that shaped their art, that beauty began with respect. Women scented their hair with oil. Men trimmed their beards and tied their hair neatly at the back. Jewellery gleamed even on those of modest means. A bronze pendant, a shell bracelet, a bead of glass catching the sun. To look well was to live well, not for display but as a reflection of inner balance. The same harmony that guided their rituals guided their work. The potter's wheel turned like the earth. The loom's rhythm matched the sea's pulse. The oars of the harbour boats beat in time with the drums of the festivals. It was all one choreography, labour as devotion, devotion as order. No task was too ordinary to hold meaning. A farmer guiding his plough or a girl fetching water from the well moved with the same calm precision as a dancer. The island itself seemed to insist upon it, every motion in its right place, every effort part of a pattern larger than any single life. Children learned by watching, by joining. They carried baskets, fetched tools, and copied the gestures of their elders until skill became instinct. There were no written laws to memorize, no overseers or armies to enforce behavior. The island did not need them. Its people moved according to custom, habit, and trust, a collective rhythm so deeply learned it required no command. To live on Crete was to understand balance, not as rule, but as nature. Even leisure followed its own grace. In the evenings, people gathered in courtyards to share food, to sing, to talk. Music drifted through the air, the low thrum of lyres, the soft beat of hands on drums. Stories were told, laughter rose, and the line between workday and celebration blurred. The Minoans seemed to have found what later civilizations would spend centuries searching for: the art of living beautifully without needing to conquer anyone to do it. Theirs was a civilization defined not by power, but by proportion. They built, traded, farmed, and feasted in a world that felt complete unto itself. The mountains guarded them, the sea sustained them, and their own grace kept order. It was not perfection. The island shook with earthquakes. The harvest sometimes failed. The storms still came. But it was peace shaped by skill, resilience, and care. As the sun set over the hills, lamps flickered to life in doorways, the air filled with the faint sound of flutes and the smell of olive wood burning. The people of Crete sat together to eat, to rest, to watch the stars climb over their quiet sea. Their civilization glowed with a calm self-assurance, as if nothing of it could ever vanish. Among all the things the Minoans built, their courtyards, their frescoes, their ships, the most mysterious was the one that could not be seen. It was their language. For all their skill in shaping stone and clay, for all their attention to form and pattern, the one design that might have revealed who they truly were was the one that time refused to share. What remains of their voice lies pressed into tablets of baked earth, scratched in neat rows of symbols that still refuse to speak. It is called Linear A, the written language of a civilization that knew how to measure the stars and plumb the depths of trade, yet somehow left the rest of us guessing what they meant. The people of Crete began writing early, though not in the way later empires would. They had no interest in monumental inscriptions or proclamations carved into stone. Their records were practical, kept on clay tablets, seal stones, and small round nodules impressed with signs. Most were stored in the palaces, tucked among the jars of oil and grain. These were the ledgers of a world that preferred order to conquest, a bureaucracy written in symbols as elegant as their art. But when the palaces burned, the tablets that were never meant to last hardened in the fire. What was meant to be temporary became immortal, and so their silence began. Linear A is unlike anything else of its age. The script flows in neat lines from left to right, its signs formed of straight strokes and small curves, giving it the appearance of both precision and music. There are more than 100 distinct symbols, some repeated often, others rarely. Alongside them appear small marks that may indicate numbers, perhaps for counting goods or sacrifices. But beyond those fragments of understanding, meaning vanishes. Scholars would later compare it to Linear B, the later script of the Mycenaeans, who came after the Minoans. But the resemblance is deceptive. Linear B records a language recognizably Greek. Linear A belongs to a tongue that seemingly no one else ever spoke. The tablets record a civilization in motion, lists of offerings, inventories of oil, perhaps hymns or contracts. Yet no one can read their contents with certainty. The signs stare back like the eyes of the frescoes, vivid, deliberate, and unreadable. The Minoans, it seems, had built a world of perfect clarity and left behind a language of fog. For all their architecture, they forgot to leave subtitles. It is tempting to imagine what they might have written, had their words endured. Did their scribes note only the practical? Grain counts, trade routes, temple accounts? Or did they also write of faith, of the rhythm of the sea, of how it felt to leap over a bull and live? The absence of their voice leaves space for every possibility. We can reconstruct their art, their rituals, their tools, but not their thoughts. The result is a civilization that feels both near and unreachable, like a melody heard through walls. The irony is that they invented writing to preserve their order, and in doing so, preserved their mystery instead. Clay was their chosen medium, simple and abundant, pressed and inscribed with a stylus while still wet. The tablets were not baked intentionally. They were meant to be erased, reused, replaced when the next season's harvest arrived. The accidental fires that destroyed their palaces baked them into permanence, freezing moments of bureaucracy into eternity. The words of accountants outlived their poets. If they had any, the practical survived while the personal was lost. Every attempt to decipher Linear A has ended in silence. The symbols resist every known grammar, every borrowed tongue. Some resemble signs from the Near East, others hint at Anatolian or Semitic roots, but none fit. Even when compared to Linear B, the results remain stubbornly inconsistent. It is as if the Minoans spoke in a rhythm that no later language could follow. A few words can be guessed, perhaps wine, offering, or honey. But these are only glimmers, like seeing the reflection of a fire through smoke. The rest is mute. That silence has its own gravity. It pulls everything toward it. The art, the architecture, the faith, turning them into interpretations instead of facts. We see their balance and assume their values, see their grace and imagine peace. But what they said, what they believed when the drums were quiet and the markets closed, remains buried in clay. The tablets speak in patterns, not in sentences. Their language, once living, has become a design, elegant, decorative, and impenetrable. To read Linear A would be to hear the Minoans again, to catch the rhythm of their thoughts. But perhaps their mystery is part of what keeps them alive. A civilization perfectly understood risks becoming a museum piece, one that keeps its secrets continues to breathe. The unreadable script is their last defense against definition. Still, the script hints at an intelligence that valued precision. The repeated signs, the use of spacing, the small marks of accounting, all show the same orderly mind that shaped their palaces and festivals. Their writing was not the invention of poets, but of administrators, people who believed that to record something was to give it permanence. And yet, in the end, permanence arrived by accident. The fire preserved what time would have erased, turning routine into relic. The ordinary became immortal. It is difficult not to feel a quiet sadness in that. The language that once filled storerooms and shrines with motion now lies motionless, pinned to museum shelves, its symbols lined like prisoners behind glass. Each sign, carved with such care, is a gesture frozen mid-air. To the Minoans, these marks had meaning as clear as sunlight. To us, they are only decoration. Civilization, for all its brilliance, depends on the thin thread of comprehension, and once that thread breaks, an entire world can vanish behind it. The story of Linear A is not just about language, it is about memory. It reminds us that knowledge can survive in form long after it dies in meaning. The Minoans left behind everything but their words. Their images still dance, their buildings still breathe, their patterns still repeat. But the voice that explained them has gone quiet. We hear only echoes now, reverberating through centuries of translation attempts and theories, none of them certain. And yet, even in silence, their influence carries. Their symbols appear in foreign lands. Their style travels farther than their ships ever could. Minoan pottery turns up in the tombs of Egypt. Their motifs re-emerge in the frescoes of Syria. Their techniques borrowed and adapted by others. Their art and ideas ripple outward, carried by traders and imitators, absorbed into the languages of other peoples. From the harbours of Knossos, Phaistos and Malea, the Minoan set out with amphorae of oil, jars of honey, and textiles dyed in shades of gold and deep red. Bronze gleamed in their cargo holds, alongside finely painted pottery wrapped in reeds for the voyage. When their ships arrived in foreign ports, Egyptian, Cypriot, Levantine, they were greeted not as raiders or strangers, but as guests. Trade, for the Minoans, was as sacred as any ritual. In the delta harbours of Egypt, Cretan sailors stepped ashore amid markets that smelled of resin, fish and papyrus. They brought gifts, cups of burnished clay, jars sealed with rope and wax, beads carved from faience. In return came linen, gold, and stories of the Nile's endless floods. Egyptian scribes record their visits with unusual precision. They called these people Keftiu, the islanders from across the sea, and painted them on tomb walls with remarkable affection. The murals at Thebes show them walking in procession, bearing offerings for the pharaoh, silver bowls, painted jars, and tiny boxes of scented oil. Their clothes are bright, their hair bound with ribbons, their faces calm and untroubled. The Egyptians rarely portrayed foreigners so generously. To them, the people of Crete were not rivals but reflections, civilized, graceful, and touched by the sea's divinity. The exchange was not only of goods, but of style. Egyptian craftsmen began to borrow Minoan motifs, spirals, lilies, and dolphins, the soft curves of bodies in motion. The influence flowed both ways. Minoan artists adopted the Egyptian love of profile and balance, while the island's scribes learned to manage record-keeping with a precision once found only along the Nile. From the eastern ports of Syria came new dyes, new perfumes, and new ideas about trade and religion. The Minoans absorbed them all without losing themselves. Their culture, like their art, depended on synthesis, taking what was foreign and making it harmonious. The Minoans' pottery became their most persuasive ambassador. Sleek and light, it travelled farther than any emissary could. Amphorae marked with spiral patterns have been found along the coasts of Anatolia and the Levant, their shapes copied by local artisans who could not quite replicate the island's mastery of form. In Cyprus, traders imitated the fine Camorra style, trying to reproduce its thinness and curve. In Egypt, fragments of Minoan vessels were stored alongside gold and ivory in royal storerooms. Their designs carried a message clearer than any language: refinement, rhythm, and restraint. To own something from Crete was to own a piece of its serenity. Through trade, the Minoans became the centre of a loose but far-reaching network of exchange. Their ships touched nearly every major harbour of the Bronze Age world. They brought obsidian from the Cyclades, copper from Cyprus, tin from Anatolia, and ivory from Africa. What they carried back was not only wealth, but wonder. The art of foreign lands mingled with their own, producing frescoes filled with unfamiliar animals, monkeys, lions, and birds that no one on Crete had ever seen. Each creature, painted in vivid colour, represented a connection, a remembered story from a distant shore. In the palaces of Crete, these influences accumulated like sediment. Egyptian patterns blended with Aegean light, Levantine pigments mixed with local clay, and every new element found its place within the Minoans' sense of order. Even their architecture reflected this openness. Storage rooms designed for surplus goods expanded, corridors grew longer, courtyards wider. Trade had transformed their island into something more than a nation. It had become a crossroads, a stage on which the world performed its exchanges. There was admiration too for the way the Minoans lived. To many of their neighbours they seemed the ideal of civility, rich but not oppressive, artistic but not indulgent. Their cities lacked fortifications, yet their influence reached everywhere. They appeared to the outside world as the proof that peace could be powerful. It was a rare and enviable image, and other societies borrowed it eagerly. Egyptian painters used Minoan motifs to decorate royal tombs. Syrian traders imitated their seal designs. Anatolian artisans copied their jewellery. even when they had to invent new methods to do so. Imitation for the Minoans became a form of immortality. Their envoys were as well known as their wares. In foreign courts, they acted as negotiators, translators, and messengers of beauty. To be Minoan was to be trusted. They arrived not with weapons, but with goods wrapped in linen and voices softened by courtesy. Their diplomacy was quiet and persuasive. When they built relationships, they built them the way they built their frescoes, with layers of colour and balance, not domination. Theirs was an empire of admiration, and it worked because others wanted to belong to it. But every connection carries its own cost. The Minoan strength depended on the same roots that made them admired. Their economy was a living thing, constantly moving, drawing breath from every harbour. If one region faltered, the rhythm shifted. If a storm closed the sea, the island waited in stillness. The Minoans had built their peace on a foundation of exchange. And exchange is fragile. A failed harvest in Egypt, a conflict in Anatolia, even a subtle change in wind or current could ripple across the network like a tremor through a web. Even the gifts of trade carried danger. Foreign visitors brought more than luxury. They brought new gods, new stories, and new diseases. The Minoans, open to influence, welcomed them all, confident that their harmony could absorb anything. But influence is never one way. The very cultures that admired them began to grow stronger, more centralized, more ambitious. The Mycenaeans on the Greek mainland built their own fleets. The Egyptians extended their reach northward, and Crete, for all its refinement, stood small between them, an island beautiful but exposed. Still, for a long time, the exchange continued. Ships arrived in the harbours, sails bright against the sun. Dock workers shouted greetings to captains from distant shores. Scribes noted shipments of oil and saffron. Traders exchanged coins and promises. On the walls of Thebes, the Keftiu envoys still marched in painted procession, eternally bearing gifts for a pharaoh who had been dust for 1,000 years. The Minoans' influence had outlived the hands that shaped it. Theirs was a civilization that understood admiration as a kind of language. To be imitated was to be acknowledged. To inspire was to endure. Their art had become a mirror in which other cultures saw themselves improved. For centuries, the sea had been kind to Crete. It glittered in their art, filled their songs, and carried their ships to the far corners of the known world. The horizon had always meant promise, not threat. On still mornings, the Aegean spread out like polished glass, reflecting the white sails of Minoan traders and the dark wings of gulls that followed them home. The islanders trusted the sea completely. It was their road, their defence, and their god. And then one day, it turned against them. North of Crete lay a smaller island, Thera, now called Santorini, curved around a sleeping mountain. To the Minoans, it was both neighbour and mirror, another island of trade and frescoes, of harbours and quiet prosperity. The two exchanged goods and craftsmen for generations. Then the mountain awoke. It began, as cataclysms often do, with omens too subtle to notice. The sea pulling strangely at the shore, the earth muttering beneath its crust. Fishermen returned with uneasy stories of strange currents and dead fish, of a red haze at sunset that refused to fade. No one yet understood that the world they knew was already cracking. When Thera erupted, it did not roar, it dismantled. The first explosions split the island open, sending a column of smoke and fire miles into the sky. The sea boiled along the shore, ships shattering where they floated. A shockwave rolled outward, flattening the villages that dotted the caldera. Then came the ash, fine and endless, falling like night in daylight. The air thickened until it could no longer be breathed. The island disappeared behind its own smoke. What followed was silence, a pause so absolute that it might have seemed divine. And then the sea rose. The tsunami struck Crete hours later. They came not as a single wall of water, but as a series of impossible breaths. The sea rushing away, exposing the seabed and its writhing fish, then returning with the full weight of the Aegean behind it. Harbours vanished. Ships that had carried olive oil and copper were lifted and hurled inland. The port towns along the northern coast, Amnisos, Malea, Palacastro, were gutted in moments. Even the inland valleys trembled as the waves receded, leaving behind wreckage tangled with seaweed and splintered masts. The ash clouds spread across the eastern Mediterranean, turning day to twilight. For weeks the sun hung pale behind a veil of dust. Crops withered, livestock died, and rain turned to mud. Trade stopped. The harbours were clogged with debris, and the once reliable winds shifted unpredictably. The same sea that had carried their civilization outward now isolated it completely. The islanders, who had lived by balance and motion, found themselves surrounded by stillness. The damage was not only physical. The Minoans' world depended on rhythm, harvest, trade, ritual, renewal. The eruption shattered that rhythm. Entire towns were lost, and with them the people who had maintained the delicate machinery of exchange. The priests who had danced at the mountain sanctuaries must have looked toward their peaks and wondered what kind of god could produce so much silence. For a society built on harmony, this was their first true discord. Thera's destruction reshaped the geography of the Aegean. Where once there had been a mountain, there was now a hollow, a crater filled with black water. The eruption was so vast that it changed the climate for years. The winter that followed was colder, the sky dimmer, the harvest late. Across the sea, in Egypt and Anatolia, records spoke of a year when the sun refused to shine. The ash that darkened their skies came from a mountain they had never seen, from an island that was now half remembered and half drowned. Yet even in devastation, the Minoans tried to continue. They rebuilt the harbours, repaired the roads, restored the frescoes of bulls and dancers, as if the old rhythm could still be summoned by will alone. But the balance had shifted. Trade routes weakened, and with them the flow of wealth that had kept the palaces thriving. Knossos endured for a time, its courtyards still echoing with processions and festivals, but the light within those walls grew dimmer. The island that had once ruled the waves was now ringed by the memory of them. The eruption of Thera may have been the first natural apocalypse in European memory, a story so large that it could not be contained by history alone. Centuries later, others would call it myth, the tale of a great island swallowed by the sea, of a proud people undone by their own splendour, would surface again in Greek stories of Atlantis. Perhaps they were remembering Crete. Perhaps the myth was simply the echo of a truth too enormous to describe directly, that even the most balanced civilization can be undone by the earth beneath it. In the villages along Crete's northern coast, people gathered on the high ground, looking out at the darkened water. They must have wondered whether the gods had gone deaf, or whether the mountain's fire was their answer. Some fled inland, carrying what they could, tools, idols, jars of grain, while others stayed, rebuilding the docks plank by plank. The sea, for all its violence, remained their only link to survival. They had no choice but to trust it again. Months passed, then years. The ash settled into the soil, the harbours reopened, and trade resumed in fragments. But something in the Minoan spirit had shifted. The island that once radiated confidence now lived in cautious rhythm, aware that the sea could betray as easily as it blessed. Their frescoes still showed bright skies and calm waves, but perhaps the artists painted them as acts of hope rather than reflection. Beneath the colour there was a quiet grief. The memory of Thera lingered everywhere, in the darkened stones of rebuilt walls, in the way people watched the horizon, in the new cracks that ran through once perfect temples. The eruption had broken more than architecture. It had fractured certainty. The Minoans had believed that beauty was a kind of protection, that grace could keep the world in balance, but no civilization, however elegant, could choreograph the sea. Over time, the survivors must have told their children stories of the day the sky fell. The details would have softened, the horror turned to lesson. The gods, they might have said, tested the island to remind it of humility. The sea, once again calm, had forgiven them. Yet even forgiveness has its cost. The balance that defined Minoan life, between trade and isolation, faith and routine, was never quite restored. From the cliffs above Knossos, one could still see the horizon stretch unbroken, but it no longer promised only peace. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the sea was still carrying the last traces of ash. The same waves that had once connected Crete to the world now carried the memory of its undoing. And in that long, eerie silence that followed the storm, when the ships were gone and the harbours lay half empty, the island waited. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. For generations, the Minoans had lived by motion. Now they faced stillness. The volcano had stolen the rhythm of their world, and into that quiet something new began to stir. In the long stillness that followed the great eruption, the island tried to heal. The ash settled into the soil, the harbours were cleared, and the ships once again began to cross the sea. Trade resumed, but it was slower now, more cautious. The Minoans rebuilt their palaces, repainted their walls, and resumed their rituals, determined to restore the rhythm they had lost. Yet something in the air had changed. The confidence that once filled Crete, the sense that the world would always move in harmony, had faded. And when new sails appeared on the horizon, few realised how permanent their arrival would be. At first, the visitors came as traders. They were the Mycenaeans, mainland Greeks from across the Aegean, heavier, rougher, more pragmatic. Their ships were built for endurance, not grace. Their cargoes filled with weapons and tools rather than art. They admired the island's sophistication, its colours and symmetry, its apparent calm. To them, Crete must have seemed a paradise of order waiting to be organised. The Minoans welcomed them, as they had welcomed so many others, with open harbours and easy trust. But these guests stayed longer than most, and over time the sound of their speech became a fixture in the markets and palaces. The change was gradual, the way a shadow lengthens over a courtyard in the afternoon. Mycenaean traders became administrators. They learned the rhythms of Minoan life, the ledgers, the festivals, the careful accounting of goods, and then they began to oversee them. Linear A, the script that had once guarded the island's secrets, gave way to a new one. Linear B, written in the language of the newcomers. It looked familiar, its symbols borrowed from the old system, but its voice was different. The words recorded now were Greek, precise and practical. Inventories replaced hymns. The written record of Crete became less like poetry and more like paperwork. The frescoes changed too. The old fluidity, the motion that had defined Minoan art, gave way to stiffness. Figures that once danced now stood in rows. Faces that once smiled became masks of solemn duty. The bright spirals and lilies faded beneath geometric borders and military processions. Even the bulls, once symbols of vitality and balance, began to appear as trophies rather than companions. The brush that once painted movement began to outline control. The Mycenaeans, inheritors of a harder world, valued order over grace, certainty over rhythm. Religion followed the same slow transformation. The gentle gods of earth and sky, the spirits of mountain and sea, were joined and then replaced by others. Names like Zeus and Poseidon began to appear on the new tablets, their demands louder and their tempers sharper. The faith that had once flowed through every part of life began to harden into hierarchy. Altars grew higher walls thicker, and the open courtyards that once welcomed the wind now looked inward, guarded and contained. The divine, once as natural as the tide, began to require temples and priests to mediate it. Even architecture started to change. The Mycenaeans were builders of fortresses, not labyrinths. They valued walls, gates, and lines of defence. The palaces of Crete began to resemble those of the mainland. Their airy courtyards, filled with new columns and chambers designed for soldiers and scribes. Where the Minoans had once trusted the sea for safety, the newcomers trusted stone. The island that had lived without walls for centuries began to enclose itself. The grace of open air gave way to the weight of fortification. The people must have noticed, though perhaps they did not name it. The festivals still took place, but the music felt slower, the dances more deliberate. The songs changed language. The goods in the storerooms were the same, oil, grain, honey, but they were measured differently, their destinations recorded in another tongue. The palaces continued to function, but the heart of them had shifted. The old Minoan administrators were replaced or absorbed, their ledgers rewritten by foreign hands. The same halls that had once echoed with chants now echoed with commands. To the Mycenaeans, the transition must have seemed natural. They brought with them structure, security, and a sense of permanence. They admired the beauty of the Minoans and tried to preserve it, even as they remade it in their own image. But the refinement that had taken centuries to build was fragile. It could not survive translation. The Minoans had built a civilization like music, measured, fluid, and alive in its tempo. The Mycenaeans tried to play the same song, but with instruments made for war. Artisans still worked in their shops, but their craft now served new masters. Pottery became heavier, less intricate. Jewellery grew coarser, its motifs turning from spirals and flowers to swords and chariots. Even the palette of Crete darkened. Where once they had painted in colours that mirrored the island's light, they now favoured tones of ochre and bronze. The art reflected the new spirit of the age, still proud, but less playful, less forgiving. The Mycenaeans respected what they found, but did not quite understand it. Theirs was a culture built on inheritance and control. To rule meant to possess, and to possess meant to catalogue. They inventoried what the Minoans had left, their warehouses, their shrines, their labourers, and in doing so, they began to erase them. The island became a province, its creativity converted into productivity. Knossos, once the living labyrinth of a people who worshipped motion, was now an archive for someone else's empire. Yet even under this new rule, traces of the old spirit endured. The craftsmen still decorated vessels with the faint curve of a wave. Women still led rituals, their gestures echoing the ancient dances of the mountaintops. The Mycenaeans, for all their discipline, could not suppress the island's instinct for grace. In their frescoes, one can still find the soft line of a Minoan painter's hand, surviving beneath layers of foreign colour. The soul of Crete did not vanish, it merely went quiet, waiting beneath the surface for a moment of calm. Still, the transformation was irreversible. The island that had once radiated influence now absorbed it. The sea that had once carried its merchants outward now carried soldiers inward. Where once every harbour had been a threshold to the world, it was now a gate to be guarded. The rhythm of Minoan life, its constant exchange of motion and stillness, was replaced by hierarchy and command. The music continued, but the melody was no longer theirs. It must have been strange to live through that twilight, to walk through the same courtyards and sense the difference in the air. The scent of oil and pigment still lingered. The jars were still full. The frescoes still shone in the half-light of the torches. Yet beneath the surface, everything had shifted. The old language of grace had been replaced by the new language of order. The visitors had made themselves at home. The guests, as the saying might go, had begun rearranging the furniture, and so Crete endured but changed. Its palaces stood, but their purpose was altered. Its people lived, but under new masters. The light that had once poured through its open halls now filtered dimly through smaller windows, glinting on weapons where once it had shone on dancers. The brilliance of the old civilization did not end with conquest. It faded quietly and inevitably, like paint losing its colour in the sun. The island slept beneath that new order, its art and language stilled, its freedom translated into function. In the great Palace of Knossos, the corridors still twisted, and the frescoes still smiled faintly from the walls, though their meaning had shifted. The scent of cinnabar and smoke hung in the air, remnants of another age. The halls echoed with footsteps that did not belong to the people who built them. The fire did not come all at once. It crept through the palaces of Crete the way time itself does, slowly, quietly, without drama at first. A torch knocked over in a storeroom, a tremor shaking a wall already cracked, a drought that turned patience into desperation. The causes blur together now, centuries later, but what mattered was not the beginning of the end. It was the silence that followed it. The island that had once danced to the rhythm of trade and faith began to move out of time with the world around it. The Mycenaean order that had replaced the old harmony grew brittle. The palaces that once recorded every grain and amphora fell behind on their accounting. Ships stopped coming. The great stores of oil and wine, once counted and sealed with care, went unused, and one by one the lights went out. It is impossible to say exactly what happened. Some blame invasion, others rebellion, or perhaps the slow suffocation of economy. The seas that had carried Crete's fortunes began to favour new routes, new powers rising on the mainland. Others point to famine, or to the lingering scars of Thera's eruption, its ash still haunting the soil generations later. The gods, so intimately tied to the land and the sea, may have grown restless as their people changed their rituals, their language, their lives. The island that had always been a crossroads began to feel like an afterthought. The rhythm of centuries faltered. The final centuries of Minoan Crete were marked by decline more subtle than dramatic. The courtyards of Knossos filled not with dancers but with scribes tallying dwindling supplies. The frescoes faded from neglect, their colours dulled by smoke and damp. Roofs collapsed, storerooms emptied, and once proud halls echoed with the sound of wind instead of festivals. Where once they painted bulls, they now built walls. Fortifications rose around the palaces, grim reminders that faith in balance had given way to fear of loss. The Mycenaean administrators who ruled the island built their defences high, but it was the spirit of Crete itself that was under siege. The decline was not one of violence alone, but of forgetting. Generations grew up speaking the new tongue, writing in linear B instead of linear A. The language of the old songs faded, its meanings lost to the children of those who once sang them. The frescoes of women and lilies were painted over with soldiers and chariots. Festivals that once celebrated renewal became commemorations of endurance. The island endured, yes, but without rhythm, endurance becomes survival, and survival without meaning is only a slower kind of death. When the palaces finally burned, there was no single conqueror to claim the victory. Fire spread through Knossos, Malea, and Phaistos, consuming walls that had stood for centuries. Whether the flames came from invaders or from within, no one can say. What is known is that the island's great centres of order, those vast labyrinths of storage and ceremony, were left as blackened shells. The clay tablets that survive tell only of administration, not of farewell. They speak of oil rations, of livestock, of harvest quotas. Then they stop. Outside the palaces, the villages carried on for a time. Farmers still ploughed their fields, shepherds still led their flocks through the hills, but the trade routes that once connected them to the world had vanished. The harbours that once hummed with ships grew quiet, the quays covered in salt and weeds. Without the sea, Crete could not feed its population or sustain its grandeur. The workshops closed, the looms fell silent, and the hands that had built Europe's first civilization turned back to simpler tasks. The world moved on, and the island returned to itself. Nature reclaimed what remained. Olive trees pushed their roots through collapsed walls, and wildflowers grew where courtyards once rang with music. The mountains, eternal and indifferent, looked down on the ruins as they always had. The Minoans, who had lived so gracefully within their landscape, were absorbed back into it. Their cities crumbled not with violence but with patience. A people who built without walls left no defence against time. For centuries afterward, the ruins lingered, shapes beneath the soil, hints of plaster in the dust. Travellers who came to Crete found fragments, but no answers. A painted fragment of a bull's horn, a column half buried in earth, a carved stone seal whose symbols no one could read. The island that had once taught the world how to live in balance was remembered only in echoes. Stories of a lost civilization, swallowed by sea and fire, began to drift through Greece like mist. The Minoans became memory, then myth. It is strange to think that so much could vanish so completely. A culture that had mastered motion, trade, art and faith left behind no written farewell, no single word to explain itself. The Mycenaeans who replaced them eventually collapsed as well, leaving their own silence in turn. By the time the Greeks began to write their stories, Crete's first civilization was already a legend. The name Minos remained, a memory of a king, a maze and a monster, but the truth that gave rise to those myths was long buried under centuries of dust. Even in ruin, Crete was never empty. The olive trees endured as they always had. The soil, darkened by ash and history, still gave fruit. Shepherds climbed the same hills that priests had once climbed to greet the sun. The air still smelled of thyme and salt. Life continued, small and stubborn, in the shadow of what had been. The island no longer ruled the sea, but it had never needed to rule it to belong to it. The Minoans faded not in conquest, but in forgetting. Their world dissolved like pigment in the rain, its beauty carried away grain by grain, leaving only outlines for others to imagine. For a time, the silence of Crete was complete. The courtyards filled with dust, the frescoes cracked and peeled, and the once clear order of their civilization blurred into the rhythm of the waves. Yet even as the last traces disappeared, something in their art and architecture refused to die. The symmetry of their designs, the openness of their courtyards, the soft curves of their pottery. These became the grammar of the Aegean. The Minoans may have been forgotten, but they had already written themselves into the world's memory, even if no one knew it yet. In the centuries that followed, the island slept. Winds swept across the abandoned plains and through the empty palaces, carrying the smell of salt and wild herbs. Stones cracked beneath the weight of their own age. The labyrinths that had once organised life now housed only dust and the faint scurry of insects. The silence was absolute, yet not final. Beneath that quiet, the shape of a story remained, waiting for hands to uncover it again. Long after their language vanished, after their gods and kings and merchants had turned to myth, the Minoans' island remained. Its soil layered with memory, its ruins patient beneath the sun. Centuries later, someone would come to dig, to name, to try to understand. But for now, the world moved on, and Crete slept beneath its olive trees, the sea murmuring softly against its shores. The light that once filled its courtyards lingered faintly in the dust, as though even time could not bring itself to forget what grace looked like. Centuries passed. The olive trees thickened across the hills. The palaces sank beneath their own dust, and the sea forgot the sound of Minoan oars. The island slept, and the world around it changed. On the mainland, new cities rose: Athens, Mycenae, Tiryns, each building its own memory of power. The people who lived there had heard stories of Crete, but not the truth of it. They knew nothing of the frescoed walls or the bright courtyards, nothing of the language that had vanished into clay. What they remembered was simpler: an island once ruled by a mighty king named Minos, who demanded tribute and built a labyrinth beneath his palace to imprison a monster. It was, as myths go, a good one. There was drama, tragedy, and a moral conveniently flattering to its teller. In Athens, they said that every 9 years, 7 boys and 7 girls were sent to Crete as payment to the king, a punishment for some ancient slight. There in the depths of the labyrinth, they were devoured by the Minotaur, half man and half bull. Then came Theseus, Prince of Athens, who volunteered to end the cycle. With the help of Minos' daughter Ariadne, he entered the labyrinth, killed the creature, and escaped by following a thread through the endless corridors. He sailed home triumphant, leaving both monster and maiden behind. The story satisfied everyone except, of course, the people of Crete, who by then no longer had the chance to correct it. Yet within that myth, fragments of truth remained, distorted but recognizable. The Greeks remembered the labyrinth because it had existed, though not as they imagined it. The Palace of Knossos, when it still stood, was a marvel of complexity, staircases looping into one another, corridors turning without warning, rooms stacked upon rooms in dizzying precision. To the eyes of later travellers, it must have seemed deliberately confusing, a place built to bewilder. The Greeks, who preferred their architecture straight and rational, turned that confusion into legend. The labyrinth became not an administrative centre, but a prison for something wild, an image of order containing chaos. The bull, too, was no invention. On Crete, it had been sacred long before Theseus picked up a sword. In Minoan ritual, bulls symbolised vitality and balance, their power harnessed through ceremony rather than conquest. The Greeks, inheriting a world of palaces they did not build, mistook reverence for horror. They transformed the sacred animal into a monster, and the act of devotion, bull lipping, into a story of blood. The Minotaur was not a creature of history, but of memory, born from a misunderstanding of faith. Still, the myth achieved something archaeology could not. It kept the island alive in imagination long after its language was lost. The Greeks called Crete a place of danger and wonder. Their poets described it as the home of clever kings, strange gods and unearthly craftsmen. They spoke of Minos as both tyrant and judge, a ruler so powerful that even after death he presided over the underworld. His name, repeated in story after story, blurred into a title rather than a man, a faint echo of the island's ancient order. Perhaps there really had been rulers of Crete whose influence reached across the sea. Perhaps their memory lingered in the trade routes, the rituals, the tales of tribute. Over generations, those details hardened into fable. What had been commerce became coercion. What had been ceremony became sacrifice. The Greeks, finding ruins they could not explain, filled them with meaning of their own. It is a curious thing how myth can outlast the truth that birthed it. The story of Theseus and the Minotaur is not a record of what happened, but it is a record of what survived. The impression left by something grand, alien and half-remembered. The labyrinth, the bull, the tribute, all shadows cast by real events that no one alive could name. In that sense, myth does what history often cannot. It remembers emotion when facts are gone. It translates ruins into lessons. The Greeks could not read Linear A, but they could imagine what kind of people had carved it. And imagination, it seems, has its own kind of endurance. The archaeologists who came millennia later were not so different from the poets. When the first shovels broke the ground at Knossos, they too were chasing a story. The legend of Minos, of Ariadne, of the Minotaur's maze, and when they uncovered the twisting corridors and painted chambers of the old palace, they felt, for a moment, as if myth had been proven right. But the truth, as always, was more complicated. The labyrinth was not a prison, it was a bureaucracy. The monster at its heart was not a beast, but an idea, a civilization so advanced that later ages mistook it for magic. The line between legend and archaeology remains thin. Each tries to describe what the other cannot. The poet sees meaning where the scholar sees dust, and the scholar sees dust where the poet once found meaning. Perhaps the two together come closest to the truth, that the Minoans, like all great civilizations, lived in a way that made later people doubt they had ever been entirely human. Even now, the story endures. The image of a man facing a monster in a maze has never really left us. It reappears in every tale of hubris, every myth about creation and destruction, every whisper that civilization is a labyrinth built around something we'd rather not face. The Greeks gave that fear a name, the Minotaur, and in doing so, they gave the Minoans a kind of afterlife. The people who once worshipped bulls became immortal as one. The myth ensured that Crete, though forgotten in fact, would never be forgotten in story. Through the lens of their conquerors and their neighbours, the Minoans survived as characters, stripped of context but not of presence. The Greeks remembered them not as traders or artisans, but as mystery itself, a mirror for everything they admired and feared about their own beginnings. And perhaps that is the gift of myth. It gives the vanished a new voice, even if the words are wrong. The real Crete lies somewhere beneath the story, still breathing in the dust. The labyrinth was never lost, it was simply buried. Beneath olive roots and centuries of soil, its corridors wait, quiet and patient. The monster, the king, the dancers, the painters, all reduced to fragments, yet all still here. The stories, for all their invention, did something that history could not. They kept the light alive. When the Minoans were gone, when their language had turned to silence and their palaces to rubble, the myth carried their name forward through time. And in that way, even error became remembrance. The legend of the labyrinth is not a distortion of their civilization. It is its echo, softened by distance, but still resonant. For 3,000 years, the island kept its secret. Beneath olive roots and drifting soil, beneath centuries of shepherds' footsteps and farmers' ploughs, the courtyards and corridors of Knossos waited. The palaces had fallen silent long before Greece learned to write its myths, before Rome, before empire and faith and everything that followed. Crete slept, and the world above it forgot. Then in the spring of 1900, a man with a hat and a trowel knelt on its soil and began to wake it again. His name was Arthur Evans, and he was about to give Europe back its first civilization, whether it wanted it or not. Evans had come searching for a legend. He'd read the stories of Minos and the labyrinth, of the bull-headed monster that had once haunted Crete, and he suspected that myth, as always, remembered something true. The locals had been finding carved stones and strange tablets for years, bits of painted plaster and fragments of pottery, the remains of something too deliberate to be coincidence. When Evans began digging at Knossos, he found walls, then stairs, then entire rooms, layered one upon another in an architectural puzzle that felt familiar and uncanny at once. As he brushed the soil from the painted stone, light fell on colours no one had seen for millennia. Red columns, blue dolphins, dancers frozen mid-motion. What he uncovered was astonishing, but what he created was something else entirely. Evans called the civilization he found Minoan, borrowing the name from myth, as if the labyrinth truly needed its king. The term stuck. It was too poetic to resist. In doing so, he gave identity back to a people who had left none of their own. Their language was unreadable, their names long gone, their gods forgotten, so he filled the silence with invention. His restorations, painted fresh over fragments of ancient plaster, turned broken walls into bright, complete scenes. He saw in them a world of grace and sophistication, a civilization of peace and art unmarred by war. And perhaps he was right, at least partly, but he was also dreaming. Archaeology, at its heart, is as much about imagination as it is about evidence. The deeper one digs, the more room there is for desire. Evans wanted to find the paradise that modern Europe had lost, a time before conquest, before empire, before the noise of modernity. In the fragments of Crete, he saw what he hoped humanity once was: balanced, gentle, intelligent. His Knossos became a mirror of his century's optimism, the belief that progress could recover innocence. The irony, of course, is that the real Minoans had been gone so long that even their ruins could no longer defend themselves from reinvention. The past is always at the mercy of the present. The more Evans uncovered, the more he reconstructed. He rebuilt staircases, painted columns, even entire rooms, guided by instinct and Victorian aesthetic sense more than by certainty. Visitors to Knossos could now walk through the palace and imagine it alive again, though much of what they saw was Evans' creation. He meant well. He wanted the world to see beauty, not rubble. But in restoring the ruins, he gave them new myths to replace the old ones. The frescoes gleamed again, the columns shone red, and for the first time in millennia, the labyrinth had a roof. What Evans revived was not the civilization itself, but the idea of it. His Minoans became the ancestors Europe wished it had, refined, artistic, and untainted by conquest. They were cast as the first Europeans, a gentle contrast to the martial Mycenaeans who came after. This image lingered for decades, shaping how the world understood not just Crete, but civilization itself. Even now, the tourist walking through Knossos sees more of Evans' imagination than of the Bronze Age reality. Yet perhaps that too is part of the story. Every generation remakes the past in its own image, finding what it needs and leaving what it cannot understand. The truth, if there is one, lies somewhere between dust and dream. The Minoans were neither saints nor phantoms, but people. Farmers, artisans, traders, worshippers, builders. They created beauty, not out of idealism, but necessity. Their harmony was hard-earned, their peace temporary, their art as fragile as their language. To turn them into myth was to do what the Greeks had done before, to translate what could not be explained into something that could be adored. Evans was not the first to mistake silence for purity, and he will not be the last. Standing in the ruins today, it is difficult to separate what is ancient from what is restored. The walls rise half new, half broken. The colours, though bright, are the inventions of another age. But even through that layer of interpretation, something real survives. The layout of the palace still confuses the eye. The staircases still twist unexpectedly. The courtyards still catch the same light that once fell on dancers and priests. The labyrinth remains, not as a structure, but as a feeling. A reminder that history is rarely a straight path, and that memory itself is a kind of maze. Evans's rediscovery changed archaeology, but it also revealed something about us. We do not uncover the past to see it as it was. We uncover it to understand who we are. In brushing the dust from Knossos, Evans revealed more than architecture. He revealed the longing of modernity for origins, for the belief that civilization began with grace instead of violence. The Minoans silent as ever, allowed the story to be told on their behalf. It was not their voice that returned to the world, but their reflection in ours. And yet, beneath the reconstruction, beneath the theories and the myths and the paint, the real Crete endures. Its stones hold the warmth of the same sun that once shone on frescoed walls. The same sea still glitters beyond the hills, unbothered by our attempts to name or define it. Time has folded the island's history back into itself, leaving the Minoans where they began. Half myth, half memory. They are no longer the people who built Knossos, nor the gods who haunted it, but something in between. A reminder that beauty can vanish and still leave an afterglow. Down by the shore, where the ruins give way to the surf, the wind smells of salt and wild thyme. The waves strike the rocks in their endless rhythm, the same rhythm that carried the first Cretan ships toward the unknown. The sea has seen it all: the birth, the glory, the silence, the rediscovery. It remembers everything and nothing. Perhaps that is the real legacy of the Minoans, not their art or their palaces, but the quiet lesson they left behind. Even beauty fades without malice. The sea simply forgets. And beneath that forgetting, history sleeps, waiting, as it always does, to be dreamed again. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story. The rise, silence, and rediscovery of the Minoans, Europe's first civilization. Feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with another forgotten corner of history you'd like explored next. If you'd like early access to more of these quiet descents into forgotten history, ad-free audio of the episodes, or just want to support the show, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. If you're listening on a podcast app, a rating or review helps more people find their way to these stories. And special thanks to the supporters who make this show possible, including our chroniclers Andrew S. and Rich Davis. Sleep well.